Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 53 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Seattle Kraken, in which the Sharks have won 3-1. So finally, the Sharks get their first ever victory against the NHL's 32nd franchise, the Seattle Kraken, and this one probably shouldn't have been as tough as it was. I mean the victory, not necessarily this game, as the Sharks lost their first two matchups against Seattle, and unlike the Vegas Golden Knights, who in their inaugural season a few years ago were a dominant team, very, very strong, ended up right at the top of the Pacific Division by year end, the Seattle Kraken are pretty much the exact opposite. They do not find themselves at the top of the Pacific Division, but instead they find themselves right at the bottom. To put things into perspective, after this game ends, the San Jose Sharks will find themselves 7 points out of a playoff spot and 17 points ahead of the Seattle Kraken, which, if you can do the math there, puts the Seattle Kraken 24 points out of a playoff spot, pretty much all but mathematically eliminated from actually making it to the postseason. So the Vegas Golden Knights, they had a ton of success. The Seattle Kraken, not so much, but yet it took the Sharks 3 tries to finally get a victory versus this team. Now, in this first period, it didn't look like a victory was going to be in the cards for the San Jose Sharks, as for, whatever reason, the Sharks have struggled in first periods, not just this game, but for the past few games, and it continued. It was an absolutely dreadful first 20 minutes. The Sharks were heavily outshot, heavily outplayed, and the only reason this one actually ends up being a tie game after 20 minutes is thanks to the heroics of James Reimer, who was playing a back-to-back game, as Bob Booner clearly has absolutely zero trust, negative trust even, into Zach Sawchenko, the Sharks' current rookie backup goaltender, with Aiden Hill currently sidelined with an injury. And as such, Reimer gets the back-to-back, and he shows up massively here. The Sharks likely could have been trailing 3-1, if not maybe even slightly worse than that in the first, if not for him. But it would be the Sharks scoring the first goal, and this was a game of firsts for San Jose, and at the start it was Ryan Dzingel. He gets his first goal as a San Jose Shark, which was nice to see. Was picked up off of waivers a couple of days ago and has slotted in, at least at the moment, onto the second line with Couture and Gregor, and nice to see him rewarded with a goal there. However, just a few seconds later, the Seattle Kraken would tie it up with a goal from Morgan Geekie, and that would be the score at the end of the first period, 1-1. In the second period, things started to turn the other way, at least a bit, for the San Jose Sharks. Played but much more of an even second period with Seattle, and in fact the Sharks were the only team to score in that second period, and that ended up coming from Scott Reedy. Reedy was a late insert into the lineup. It looked like, with Cogliano still sidelined with his personal issue, that Jonathan Dahlen would once again play, but Bob Booner has such a hatred at this point for Dahlen playing, just because of his struggles over the past week or so, that he decides to go to the AHL, something that we know he doesn't particularly like, and he picks out Scott Reedy to come up here onto the third line, and Reedy ends up rewarding him for that, as he gets a goal in that second period, his first career goal, to put the Sharks up 2-1 after the second period. And into the third, again, relatively evenly played. Seattle Kraken end up heavily outshooting the Sharks, mostly just based on how much they outplayed them in that first period, but the Seattle Kraken also get into some major penalty issues in the third period, taking a couple and then challenging this upcoming goal for the Sharks, as Gadjevich gets his first of his career with the San Jose Sharks. Was also a waiver wire pickup like Dzingel, though Gadjevich was picked up right at the start of the season. And so basically this game, like I said, it was a game of first, but it was also a game of extremely unlikely suspects. I mean, Dzingel not so much, but Reedy absolutely, and Gadjevich, who has been in the lineup a lot for the Sharks, but has done essentially nothing prior to this game, he manages to get his first goal. Now, was it the most skilled goal? Was it something that Gadjevich is going to easily be able to replicate in coming games this season and in his future? Absolutely not. It was essentially incredibly lucky, and Gadjevich probably will never see another goal like that for Gadjevich again, but still, at the end of the day, in a month's time, people will look back and say, hey, Gadjevich got his first goal. They won't ask how he got it. Onto the lineups. Like I said, the first period for the Sharks was just absolutely horrible. There were literally only 2 good shifts in that first period. Surprisingly, one from the fourth line. The other was, of course, the Sharks' goal from Dzingel. But from the second period onwards, things, like I said, did pick up for the Sharks, and that starts with the Sharks' first line. Meier, Hertl, and Barabanov had a couple of very, very nice shifts. Barabanov setting up some very good plays. Meier continuing to dominate as well. Hertl doing his part. But interestingly enough, a stat that I saw is that this is actually the first win for the San Jose Sharks this season in which neither Meier nor Hertl registered a point. So while they did do a lot, they did bring some decent pressure. They didn't get on the scoreboard, and yet it didn't matter. The Sharks managed to get the victory anyway, which was pretty interesting to see nonetheless. On the second line, we of course did have that Dzingel goal as he was paired with Couture and Gregor as usual, but otherwise, besides the goal, the second line kind of struggled pretty significantly. They just don't seem to have a ton of chemistry to get together. It's weird with Noah Gregor because every time he's on that bottom 6, he creates a lot of pretty solid chances for himself, some very good chances at times. He's just unable to actually score on them, and then it makes you think like, hey, maybe if, he was playing with slightly better players on a second line or something like that, he'd actually be able to score more goals. And then the moment he's actually inserted into the top 6, things just completely fall apart. Gregor really hasn't done much of anything over these past couple of games since being put onto this second line, so it seems as though he might just be much more suited for a third line role, especially since when you are paired with Logan Couture, that means you're playing against the other team's top players, and that makes it even harder for a player like Gregor to break free with his speed like he had been doing in the past. And then when it comes to just Gregor and Dzingel has set up over these past few games with the Sharks some nice passes, but generally things just haven't looked all that great as a line. He did manage to get the goal, but not necessarily the best of games anyway. On to the third line, this was Nieto Bonino as well as Scott Reedy, although it should be noted that by the end of the first period and a bit into the second period, that third line was actually changed a bit. Bonino and Nieto actually ended up being joined by Jeff Viel, and the fourth line of Gadjevich, Weatherby, and Scott Reedy was put together, and that fourth line ended up carrying the San Jose Sharks, which is not a sentence that I thought I would ever utter at all this season, but it actually was the case. Weatherby, Gadjevich, Viel, at the start at the very least, and then Reedy, who took over at the end. They actually had very solid games, some solid forechecking in the offensive zone. That one shift that I talked about in the first period where the Sharks actually looked good, one of the 2 shifts, this line really was hard working. They got the puck back a lot in the corners, using that physicality that Bob Booner loves to talk about. It was actually at the front of the stage finally at that point. So this one probably earns them another rest of the season in the lineup if I had to guess, because they were doing absolutely nothing before and they continued to manage to get a lineup spot, so you would think that with an actual good game here tonight, they're pretty much golden for the rest of the season. So the bad news, I guess, from this would be that Jonathan Dahlen may stay sidelined a bit longer, especially since that once Balcers returns, there's going to be a bit of a log jam. We'll see if Dahlen manages to find his way back into the lineup, because I do not see how you can take Scott Reedy out of it at this point after that goal he did score and just how generally solid the fourth line was. On to the defensive pairings, and for once, I actually have some good things to say about this first pairing. Middleton and Burns are, of course, the usual first pairing for the San Jose Sharks, and they finally played as such. Brent Burns had a very solid game here tonight. Jacob Middleton had an extremely good game here tonight as well. I thought this was far and away the Sharks' best defensive pairing, which was absolutely nice to see. I've talked about in the past how Brent Burns has had an extremely inconsistent season, but finally we do have an actual good game. I doubt this lasts. I assume he's going to go back to being bad, good, bad, good, bad, good, but we did finally catch him on that good, and it was an extremely good one at that. Middleton has complemented Brent Burns very, very well. When Ferraro, prior to his injury last game, when he was paired with Brent Burns, there was I don't know, the pairing just wasn't really working all that well, unlike how it was working pretty well at the during the entirety, mostly, of last season. But now with Middleton and Burns, he's been doing a good job at really calming down the pairing, I guess you could say. Middleton obviously much more defensively based than a player like Mario Ferraro, so this pairing looking quite solid. We'll see what happens when Erik Karlsson returns from injury, as apparently that's only a few games away. When it comes to the other usual suspect that I like to talk about, that is Ryan Merkley. A couple interesting developments here tonight, as Merkley was not nearly as good as he has been over these past couple of games. A bit of a up and down game, I would say. A couple of very nice plays in the offensive zone, but also a couple of issues in the defensive zone. Had some giveaways that led to some great chances for Seattle, and generally found themselves hemmed into the defensive zone a lot more than usual. However, his ice time doesn't necessarily reflect that. Usually Bob Booner would be very punishing of Ryan Merkley in a situation like that, but not necessarily this game. Now, this could be partially due to the fact that the Sharks did have 5 power play here tonight, and Ryan Merkley, of course, plays on the second power play unit, but still, Merkley ended up with just over 19 minutes of ice time here tonight, which, showed that Bob Booner, at the very least, is loosening the leash on him very, very slightly at this point. I mean, just at the end of this game, in the last 3 or so minutes, we actually saw Ryan Merkley get a shift when the Seattle Kraken had the goaltender pulled. It didn't last particularly long, and eventually Brent Burns came on the ice and pretty much played the last 2 minutes of the game, but still, the fact that Merkley was even in a situation like this does show the beginning of a little bit of a trust level. And finally, to talk about the Sharks goaltender, I was quite adamant that the Sharks should not be starting James Reimer in this back-to-back, that Zach Sawchenko should be given an opportunity to start a game, especially against a Seattle Kraken team that isn't necessarily known for being, well, a very good team at all. And yet, Reimer gets the start and does exceptionally well here tonight. Certainly cannot blame him at all. He played his heart out. He was once again the MVP for the San Jose Sharks. There's a lot of talk about Timo Meier being the Sharks MVP thus far this season, and I still think that he's probably right up there in first place, but it is an extremely close race with James Reimer, the Sharks goaltender, who has also been a massive, massive force for the San Jose Sharks, and the only reason why they're not right in where the Seattle Kraken are in the standings. So that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, where they will take on the Vegas Golden Knights for the second time this season. The first matchup with the Golden Knights did not go particularly well at all. The Sharks lost pretty handedly 4-1, so they'll be looking for some revenge against the NHL's second newest franchise. Class dismissed.